Alrighty. Hi, everyone. There is an echo here. So I'm highly caffeinated and only have a little bit of jet lag, but wanted to say thanks for coming, and we're going to talk about documentation, one of my favorite things and something that I've really kind of jumped into this year. So to start, a little bit about me. I currently live in Texas, and this year I've been helping a number of startups with everything from organizing hackathons and conferences to launching open source products and really getting into like user-centered development. And I've learned some things along the way around documentation. So this talk is going to be about going from good to great, because how many people here have documentation? Okay, so we've all got documentation, but how can we like really get the most impact out of it, and why it's so important? So documentation is important because, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, but if you offer an API as part of your business strategy, I want to be really explicit about what that means and some of the things that we might take for granted. So we're going to talk about some of the fundamentals and ask what makes something go from good to great. I wanted to preface everything by recognizing assumptions about an API, because not every API can hit these things. The world is not perfect. Some APIs solve problems that don't need to be solved, and some of them are either too abstract or they don't allow enough customization. So we're going to assume that your API solves a problem and that it allows enough customization and abstraction for a developer to actually get in there and do what they want to do. We also understand that the world is not perfect and it's a moving target. So this is why I think documentation can be so hard to maintain, and also why it's so important to really emphasize it. So why would we talk about documentation at a conference if we've all got it and we all recognize it? There's hundreds, if not thousands, of articles out there about these things and best practices. It's important because documentation drives ease of use. Ease of use drives adoption, conversion, and therefore revenue. The more people that you can get using your product means that you'll get a more diverse user group, you'll get new devs, experienced devs, devs from international places, startups, enterprises, and devs, obviously, as Chase said, talk. You know, they share information. We're at conferences, and if you've got a great experience, devs will let other devs know, which again drives revenue and adoption and makes everyone happy. Something as fundamental as documentation can be responsible for part of this process. Don't take my word for it. This is GitHub's open source report that came out earlier this year. And how many people here have had problems working with an open source project, trying to get it going? Like just even a first time to Hello World. Right. So many times, open source projects especially lack good documentation. It's hard to figure things out. And you're left feeling like, is it me? Is it them? It's more than just a 404 error code. It's more than just a 301 or a 202. Being able to really understand what's happening creates that mental model and that conceptual mindset for a developer to be able to play with your API and therefore extract what they want the most out of it. To me, an API is an abstraction, and documentation is an abstraction of an abstraction. An API really just allows someone to push and pull your data and have access to some or all of it. Documentation is kind of this middle layer that a developer or user will use to therefore understand your API and understand your data. Now let's take a look at what actually makes something go from good to great. What is great? To me, great means exceeding expectations. It means adding or subtracting something to make it either easier or more fun. One way to do this is to be really user-centered, the importance of understanding others. It's not about the words you use, it's about the words you use to a particular person at a particular time with a particular skill set. This brings me to something called heuristics. Heuristics are approaches to problem solving that use practical methods not guaranteed to be optimal or perfect, but sufficient for the immediate goals, i.e. lean, agile, iterative, all the things that we use and love. Heuristics, when we think about documentation, can be a first-time user, can be an experienced user. Think about documentation for someone that's getting paid to use your product versus someone that's using your product for fun. Those are two totally different experiences, two totally different motivations. And understanding that will really help you craft your documentation to a specific person and a specific need. So when I say developer at a company, most people are like, yeah, a developer, I get it. And you know what? You can find success with that. You can get 80% of the way there. But by going through primary user research and by getting to know a particular user to a really finite degree, you can get that extra 20%, and that's what goes from good to great. Solutions to user-centered problems. Treat your API like an interaction interface, because after all, it is. People don't realize, and they forget sometimes, that the command line is an interface. You're really just working with this data. Jacob Nielsen is a usability consultant most known for kind of defining UX. And I think that his rules apply to API documentation as well. Things like visibility of system status. This is more than just a error code. Like, what does that mean? You know, is it a page to actually know if it's me or you? Is it details into an error? Things like this can really help. He also recommends matching between system and the real world. So these are things that are words and phrases that are familiar to your audience. Don't throw some word in there that sounds really, really smart if it's not going to help. It's just going to alienate your audience. Also, consistency and standards. Users should not have to wonder what you mean by a certain word. And it can be different across orgs, across countries, across roles. Finally, recognition rather than recall. This is a good one. This, to me, if you're not doing this, you end up with 17 tabs open just trying to work with something. So having an entire journey map for a user set out and understanding the information that they're going to need along the entire journey will keep from, this 20-tab problem solving, just kind of pushing and hacking to see if something will work, and rather have one page. Second, one other reason that we can go from good to great is semantics. And this is like a really kind of fundamental basic thing. It's the importance of language, semiotics, and the words that we choose. So when I say the word apple, how many people think of a fruit? Okay, a couple, right? But when I say apple, maybe it's, because I'm using a Mac, or there's an Apple there, we're at a software conference talking about APIs, we're already primed to think of Apple the company. And it's things that we take for granted, these biases that we have. So when I say platform, I guarantee that if I ask 5 of you what that means, I'm going to get 5 different responses. For instance, if a dev says that there's a problem with a client, totally different than if an account person says that there's a problem with a client. Framework. This is another good one. Framework to me is like strict, it's defined, it's its own language, it's its own thing. But to a project manager, a framework is just like hundreds of them, right? Even the word API itself. To some people, API means a public function or like a public library. But to me, an API is this RESTful thing that has endpoints and it enables access to services and methods. One time I remember marketing material came out and said that we had 50 APIs. And we all kind of looked around and we were like, do we have 50 APIs? We didn't have 50 APIs. We had like 12. But between those 12, all we could gather is that there were like 50 endpoints. So it's this lost in translation thing that marketing has spent thousands of dollars talking about these 50 APIs. And it was just, that was bad. It was a bad day. Something as simple as that. So what are solutions to these semantic issues? Well, one is being cognizant of internal org lingo. You could have a glossary exercise where you actually go through and say what you mean. The word SDK was like an argument point for a team I was on. Everyone had a different definition of what an SDK was. But being really explicit and then either just publishing that glossary internally or even externally can totally gain alignment, and it can really help your users too. Be aware of semantic change. Words change over time. An event is different for different APIs. An event handler can be different, along the process of using something. And we tend to use these words a whole lot and kind of forget that we might mean different things at different times. And then finally, be sensitive to bias. These are the kinds of things that you see where, too many times we default to Mac the company or Mac the product, but maybe we're talking about apples. And finally, visual design. This is one other thing that we definitely take for granted. We consume documentation through our eyeballs. Therefore, we should be really sensitive to this medium. Also, one thing that's really not given any attention or love is accessibility. Understanding that not everyone can have access to your product on the fastest Wi-Fi with the coolest laptops and big screens. So being accessible and being sensitive to your users' needs will, again, open up a whole new diverse group of people in your audience. Strategies to help with this: thinking about information hierarchy and visual hierarchy, branding and interaction design, readability versus legibility, some real fundamentals of how our eyes and brains work together to understand and consume information. So think about the site Medium. If you go there and read articles, it's a pleasant experience. Now think about a site with tons of pop-ups, and there's ads, and there's like flash banners or whatever it is, and if you've got Privacy Badger or some sort of, pop-up blocker up there, like you see 50 JavaScript things trying to get it. Like, I spend no time on those sites now. I want to spend time on the sites that are just fun to look at, right? And this is an opportunity to have fun. Brands like Glitch or products like Algolia, it's just a really delightful experience. If people are using your API, they're using your brand. They're signing up to use your brand in your company. And therefore, the visual and interaction design is a great way to show it off. Solutions to visual problems: visual contrast. Draw the eye around the screen consciously. If you can think about documentation where you've had like 5,000 words in one frame, it's really difficult to figure out where you are. If you lose that page, you have to go back and scroll around and search and try to find what you're looking for. But if you've got great hierarchy, the brain will actually recall where it was, and it can go find that information again. And personality. Too many times documentation is just kind of boring. I wanted to call out this idea of legibility versus readability. This is getting to the medium, page that you just kind of want to sit on and you can hang out. If people are going to stare at your documentation and you want them to use your documentation and you want them to use your API, then you need to understand that they're going to be staring at it for a while. So things like contrast, typeface, type size, leading and spacing between lines, they all make an impact. Finally, documentation is hella important and your #1 source of content. So make it great.